Hello everyone and welcome to the Research Networking Day of CTM Festival 2021. My name is Anita, Jóri, and I'm a research associate at Berlin University of the Arts and one of the curators of the discourse program of this festival. And the Research Networking Day, I would say, is a platform to exchange ideas and new researches and all those things people do around nowadays. And we invite always different not only researchers but also artists to present their actual research and all those things they are doing. For example, from the fields of audio, arts, media, design and related theoretical disciplines. So these are our main focus here and also for today. Every year we send out COFO papers, normally by the end of the summer, and ask people to reflect on the actual festival topic, which is transformation in the case of 2021. And we always have different cooperation partners for this program. This year we invited Leuphana University, German Association for Music Business and Music Culture Research, and Humboldt-University of Berlin to cooperate with us on this project. And I have to say that despite the actual situation, I'm including here obviously COVID-19, we received many applications for the Research Networking Day, and we chose 9 excellent abstracts to be presented here today, which you will also hear later on. We also separated these 9 presentations into 3 main topics, which are the following, and I will just read out the different titles. Posthuman Sounds, which will be later on hosted by Ahlers, Performativity, Tradition and Magic, hosted by myself, and The Way Stories Unfold, hosted by Shintaro Miyazaki. So just a little bit about the structure of the day. We will have about 3 sections, and you will see that we will have 30 minutes little breaks in between them. Every single session has 3 presentations, each of them about 10 minutes, and then every presentation we will have 10 minutes for the discussion. So we have kind of a tight plan for today, but I guess we will go through that. So now, before I would give the word to the first session, I'd like to introduce the first host, Ahlers, who is a professor for music education and popular music studies at Leuphana University in Lüneburg, and his fields of expertise include empirical research on music, creativity and education. His recent publications include co-edited volumes such as Perspectives on German Popular Music, Big Data and Music, or Music and Empowerment. So I would give the word to Michael now, and who will host now the first module. Hello, Michael.
Hello, Anita. Thanks a lot for having me. So this is the panel on posthuman sounds. The posthuman or posthumanism is as a philosophical strand or theory has got various approaches and cannot be called homogeneous. With disciplinary backgrounds in philosophy, science and technology studies, literary studies, critical theory and more, it seems there is a huge body of discourse or even several discourses. So this fits kind of perfectly with the ideas of CTM's discourse program. As J.D. Bolter summarizes 2016, quote, posthumanism designates a series of breaks with foundational assumptions of modern Western culture, in particular, a way of understanding the human subject in relationship to the natural world in general, end quote. So in most of these theoretical works, anthropocentric views are usually altered by non-human agency and inclusions of practical as well as material terms in cultural theory. The assumption of human exceptionalism is avoided here. Subjects are, to speak with Rosie Braidotti, nomadic, that is to say transversal, relational, affective, embedded, and embodied. Furthermore, topics such as changed views on or extensions and enhancements of bodies, as well as cyborgs, machines, or artificial intelligences have become quite common subjects. Today we will get a series of presentations that are well informed on these matters. All of our presenters draw from theoretical frameworks such as Foucault, Deleuze, Guattari, Haraway, Braidotti, Karen Barat, and others, ranging from post-structuralism to agential realism, working on examples from the 19th century to the very present times, including the COVID-19 pandemic. And you will also get an overview on theories I just mentioned too. So it's going to be a ride. Sometimes you need to be very awake to catch up on all the details of the sometimes packed inputs, I would call them, that you will receive now. But please use all communicational channels CTM provides you with. We are very happy to answer and discuss your inputs. So I'm very thankful to moderate these topics, and now let's go. Our first presenter is Elina Tapio, who recently is completing a master's degree in cultural analysis at the University of Amsterdam, focusing her research on sound ecology and biopolitical relations between humans and non-humans. And now you've noticed maybe we had to change order, so the presentations will take a different run than on the program you could find on the webpage. The title of Elina's presentation is Sonic Interactivity. The presentation is on Sonic Interactivity, and the title is Between the Mute and the Deaf, Tracing Non-Human Worlds Through Sonic Cartographies of the Unknown. Welcome, Elina. The virtual stage is yours now.
First, I'd like to thank all the organizers at CTM for reconfiguring this year's Research Networking Day to this online format and inviting me to speak here. So I'm going to talk a bit about my research on how we sonically share space and become entangled with non-human worlds. This is a call to think sonically about relationalities beyond subject-object interactions and move towards a sonic interactivity. I'm going to shortly inquire into ways in which the sonorous can reconfigure binaries between presence and non-presence and the biopolitical implications of this. For example, activist movements have highlighted the sonic dimension to address the violence linked to it. Think about the Silence Equals Death project founded in the 80s in response to the AIDS crisis, or the statement white silence is violence, referring to the lack of speaking up on racial injustice from those who benefit from white supremacy. Such statements point towards the social death that silencing and muteness constitute, and the problem of becoming a sound subject in the ears of the listener. If silence is taken as the sonic paradigm of political imperceptibility, then it is also in the sensual presentation of the world where power dynamics are located. Here, sonic matter entails an exposure to the other, and its mattering is brought into being by listening. As presence constructs political subjects, it is important to probe how this unfolds when it comes to non-humans, whose agency within our social order of anthropocentrism is bound by their muteness. As such, we may think about binaries between sound versus silence, or signal versus noise, as conjunctures where biopolitical arguments are crystallized. But what is it to listen to those who cannot speak? The way in which I speak of silence here is not a metaphorical tool, but refers to a material ontoepistemic issue on becoming present. Sonic presence substantiates beings with ontological value, which begs the question, what is the place of sound in creating mattering subjects? This leads to consider the premise that to listen to those at the threshold of politics, which present themselves to us as the inconceivable, unapproachable, and the epistemically insecure, is to listen at the threshold of audibility, where the material and phenomenal qualities of sound escape our human system of signification. Thinking with not yet actualized sonic phenomena that persist as silence, unidentifiable vibrations, or the more than human frequencies, as it is here where the limits of our knowing become materialized. Tracing the non-human from the stance of sonic non-presence problematizes a view common to Western modernity that approaches this as the ultimate unknowable, a relative state tied to the notion of a universality of existence and one singular human reality over anything else. Forms of superiority are enabled when confronted with one's limits of knowing and ability to hear the other. As read in this quote from The Sound Machine by Roald Dahl, accessing more than human frequencies in this fictional narrative points towards a lurking danger in crossing borders, a warning sign, for this ultimately shakes the grounds which Enlightenment humanism is built upon. The issue for caring for this world, the inhabitants of it, or the biosphere, seem to more deeply arise as a struggle of understanding one's own relationality to the world. And so an event like ecological crisis keeps on problematizing the notion of humanity. This crisis pushes us to untangle our constrained view of the world, for it weighs heavily onto the shortcomings of anthropocentrism. Sound has a unique disposition to create relations between bodies, and its continuous becoming in the form of resonances that territorialize or deterritorialize the fixivity of things. Through this, we may approach sound as that which highlights a metaphysics outside the realm of static forms or identities, to think with movements, lines, and the dynamic nature of sonorous traces, substituting being with becoming in a Deleuzian sense, or conceiving sonic relationality through entanglement and interactivity as configured by Karen Barad. Theories as such point towards entanglements that transpire through the senses, as showcased in this drawing by Tim Ingold. Though this sketch more so describes properties of sight, it fittingly illustrates the sensorial co-constitution of a becoming's identity. But what would it be to think sonically in this way? A common view on the nature of sound is that it is put in motion by a sender body and registers as the signal in the receiver body. In this conversation where vibrational matter constitutes sound and listening amounts to a sonic world making, we run into the twofold issue of what sound is and what listening does. Both hold a partial position. Firstly, human audibility is limited to a tight frequency range. Secondly, with listening, we make meaning according to some pre-established framework, which is ultimately mediated by subjective desire. There can be no pure listening in the same way that there is no pure sound. François Bonnet advocates for what he calls a schizological approach to sound to embrace the unsynthesizable multiplicities it is composed of. As he states, quote, "The schizological objective is not to reduce sound to a physical phenomenal composite object. It is rather a matter of considering sound under its twofold aspect of phenomenon and event, without ever attempting a synthesis of the two. Sound must be considered as a ubiquitous entity located both in the physical generation of the phenomenon, in its propagation, and in its reception," end quote. A heterogeneous approach as such indicates that our responsibility to sound is radically indeterminate. So is the coming of our responsibility towards the sounding environment. To approach an alternative to a humanist search for meaning, I'm drawing attention to the heterogeneity of sonic phenomena and its implication on the stratification of vibrational matter into meaning. For this, Barad's notion of interactivity is explanatory of the unstable trajectories that resonances build. Her theoretical work gives us a new materialist literacy from the perspective of quantum physics. Interactivity refers to the ongoing dynamism between things, a dynamism not merely between separate entities, but from within, entities that become because they interact. As Barad states, quote, "There are no separately determined and individual entities that interact with one another. Rather, the co-constitution of determinately bounded and propertied entities results from specific interactions," end quote. Similarly, in an entanglement, entities become connected and behave in the same way, therefore becoming a system of their own. In other words, they become one system because their individual behavior is co-constituted by one another. Barad questions what are the wider philosophical implications of the unstable nature of quantum phenomena. The end of the atomic reality has been brought about the unreality of quantum theory. This drives us to approach the world at hand through the notion of entanglements and the agencies at play that bring them about. Interactivity aids in probing the material semiotic structuring of meaning and the complex topology between humans and non-humans, beyond reducing these to subject-object relations. Interactivity also reconfigures how responding unfolds, which is how we get into thinking about sonic phenomena in a different way. This too is an act of becoming entangled. When we become exposed to phenomena, we are constitutive subjects in their becoming and vice versa. This makes us all connected into a relational ontology and responsible from within. By this I mean we are already responsible for things, as we are agents who bring agency into being while simultaneously being transformed by the agency of matter. Therefore, the call to responsibility is located within the material assemblages brought about by interactivity. Interactivity shows that matters of care are bound up in the immanent becoming with the world. This accounts for worlds that may become, because they decenter the human from an epistemic nucleus. Thinking through phenomena like entanglements broadens what we may call identity and presence. Applying this to a sonic relationality would make it probabilistic by nature, deconstructing harmful binaries between us and the other. This can move us towards a knowing that unfolds during an encounter rather than being a possessive form of a knowledge of. Probing a sonic response ability becomes an affair in which we move past listening and make room for a becoming sonic. Posthumanism too questions the givenness of this split between humans and non-humans, for which it embraces thinking through the ever-present interactivity between beings. as this rejects the notion of a fixed entity or an inherent identity. Approaching a sonic episteme on a molecular basis is illuminative of embodiment and a transcorporeal knowing. To approach sound as a tool towards a semiosis that seeks to engage with non-human worlds beyond their humanification, solving ecological conflicts as ontological obstacles. Attuning into sound in this way focuses on the differential co-constitution of interacting beings, which is a much-needed counter-narrative to the caricaturing of non-human worlds within our image. The blueprint for post-human ethics may therefore arrive between the variables of sonorous formations, where knowing the non-human takes place. Recognizing this is one step away from a politicized notion of a singular reality over all beings, and towards a heterogeneous relational interdependency with one's environment. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for the fantastic presentation. I was wondering, you cited Karen Barat, and you said you talked about the co-constitution of determinately bounded and propertied entities result from specific interactions, and you used the term of entanglements throughout your presentation, and it's very regularly. Could you please give an example, maybe based on sound, of these interactions within entanglement, which is quite maybe tough to get because people might not be very much into these theories yet.
Like a sonic example of this, you mean?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, a large part of what I'm basing this on, that has been part of my research also, is bioacoustics and how single species form territories within certain biospheres. Mostly citing Bernie Krause here, he talks a lot about how in a biosphere you have these auditory territories that single species have, but the way they emerge are in relation to other species. So they would occupy a certain auditory niche, whether that be defined by timbre, amplitude, duration. So in order for these sonic territories to form also, it entails a mutual becoming with the other species also. They're wholly relational and interdependent of each other. So I think there's a lot in soundscape ecology that kind of points towards this also already.
Oh yeah, would be great to add the expertise of the upcoming presentation, actually, because I don't think you guys know each other, but Siobhan will be talking about termites, and I think there might be some connections between those presentations which perfectly match, to my opinion. I'm just checking all the channels for people's questions. Okay, at the moment I don't see any of these, so maybe I go on a little. So did you use cartographies of these types of sonic relationalities yet, or does this work as an heuristic or taxonomy? How do you use them, or is it more a descriptive way that you apply these?
Maybe just something we can get attuned to and understand how we approach other beings, rather than, let's say, from a linguistic paradigm, but something that refers to more than just fixed categories. Because I'm approaching sound in a way that it refers to the poetics of time and space, and how the material qualities of it produce phenomena, and how we're also agents in how that is brought about. So not only have I been looking a lot into bioacoustics, but also mostly in like art objects and how different art objects deal with sort of interjecting non-human agency into the way they produce their art, which I think is very interesting in this conversation. Mm-hmm.
We've got one question on the chat, and I will just read it to you. Hannah's asking if you could go into Dahl's sound machine more and how the short story relates to your research.
Yeah, so in this story, it's this very short rudimentary narrative of the protagonist who creates this machine that he can suddenly access these frequency levels where the biosphere sounds out. how the narrative unfolds is this very human emotional response and trying to understand it through this kind of anthropocentric point of view, in a way that how to give justice to the suffering plants, because there's flowers being cut down in this story, and a tree wounded with an axe, which results in him asking a doctor to fix it up with iodine. But I think the story sort of humorously comments on like the shortcomings of anthropocentrism also, because often, as we see with the way that, not completely, but how ecological crisis is dealt with, is often trying to impose a humane framework onto the suffering of ecology, which doesn't really lead us to anywhere. But it kind of, the way where this is coming from is that testimonies of violence are often associated with acts of speech. So then it becomes a very curious question to ask, like, how can an environment testify to acts of violence? Which is sort of the whole point of this research, then, to move away from these testimonies to rather like a relationality through sound, and how we might understand, for instance, let's say, ecocide in certain areas of the world as spaces of disappearance, for instance, where the soundscape has radically been transformed by forces of industrial capitalism or something. Yeah.
Thank you. Now there's a question from Federico. I hope this one could get a short answer. I will just read it to you. It is, how do you think bioacoustics and sound ecology should be included into the policies of music cities?
Music cities.
That's this huge network of cities, like Hamburg and Liverpool and other cities.
Well, I mean, coming back to what I said about testifying to violence, I think with soundscape ecology, you kind of get hearing into transformations within a certain area. So if we're talking about, are we talking about sort of the destruction of certain biological areas or biospheres? Because then we can kind of maybe listen through of what those changes have been. Does that answer the question?
Well, I just read it to you, actually. Federico can answer in the chat. I think it's a tough one, actually, because, we know there's so many translations between these theoretical approaches and maybe the centering of the humane and the non-anthropocentric approaches, and then on the other end there's policies. So there's a huge way to go to include these sort of approaches into policies of music cities, I think. So it needs different actors to engage on these aspects, I think.
Yeah, I think that's the kind of the difficulty of this whole conversation, because when it comes to policy or even politics, you're kind of talking about certain territorial behavior. If we define politics in a way that it's the inclusion of some beings and the exclusion of others, and then you have the way I'm talking about sound here is this imminent becoming with the world, which is a very deterritorializing way to approach other beings. So I guess to that, I would say, with the things that I'm talking about, maybe trying to more find alternatives of how to think differently about them. But there is definitely, as you pointed out, actually finding tools to create policies out of this would then almost kind of be antithetical to what I'm talking about.
Yeah. So, and Taika also responded to that question, and she said we need to think of the non-humane more. And I think so. Then this is part of our panel today, and taking a look at our time, I think we're about to be done. Or is there anything you need to add, or anything you want to have some famous last words or something? Your last 2 cents?
Oh, God, I don't think so. I mean, I'll be in the Discord chat. If anyone else has more questions, I can answer there.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, please keep this in mind. All of the presenters will stay here even after the panel is done. There's another half an hour, so we'll be on the Discord chat as well. So then, thanks a lot, Elina, and we need to switch for the next presenter, which I will introduce right now. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So, our second presenter is Siobhan Leddy, who is currently a first-year PhD student at the Freie University at Berlin. She's an occasional artist and writer researching more than human communication and artistic practice, and she's already published in The Outline, Real Life, and others. The title of today's presentation is Termite Listening, Environmental Knowledge Through Sound. Welcome, Siobhan. The virtual stage is yours now.
If we try to think of some things we know about our environment, immediately some quite alarming figures spring to mind. Accelerating rates of species extinction, sea temperature increases, elevated carbon emissions. Through data such as these, we comprehend the planet. Data-driven knowledge often appears to be definitive, as though this cybernetic or computational approach is the only mode of knowledge capable of conveying the true realities of climate change. Yet despite the abundance of figures, numbers and trends, this form of knowledge has failed to mobilize meaningful change. We have more awareness than ever of, say, the disastrous effects of CO2 emissions, yet more fossil fuels are burned each year. And perhaps one reason for this disjuncture between knowledge and action is because the very logic that underpins data-driven knowledge is only capable of reproducing those same capitalist human-planet relations. By replicating the same logics of capitalism, data-driven knowledge forecloses any possibility of transforming many humans' current Promethean relation to the Earth. Data-driven knowledge has an accumulative tendency. While capital must endlessly colonize and financialize that which lies outside of itself, as Rosa Luxemburg correctly noted a century ago, data likewise attempts to bring the entire planet into its own logic. Data must datify the Earth, abstracting it into numerical forms in order to fit predictive climate algorithms. By following a logic of first abstraction of the Earth and then its accumulation, both capital and data-driven knowledge appear to be definitive and total. In the case of capitalism, this imagined totality has been described by Mark Fisher as capitalist realism. And so too is the imagined total knowledge of planetary computation, no matter how many EU-funded cybernetic models there might be, no less a restrictive fantasy that forecloses more emancipatory earthly futures. So I'm curious about other modes of knowledge creation and sharing between humans, non-humans, and material environments. If it's the abstractive and accumulative tendencies of capitalism that are responsible for climate collapse in the first place, then a kind of knowledge is required that works against rather than mimics these logics. Rather than a Promethean accumulation that veers towards totality, could a relation be predicated on a partial reception of receiving the knowledge that's offered to us? And this isn't a passive relation, but rather an active cultivation of what Rosalind Morris has called the miner's ear. And like the miner listening out for tunnel collapse, we might be able to attune ourselves to changes in our environment. And I call this termite listening, not so much to escape the anthropocentrism of the ear, but rather because soldier termites are very sensitive to the sonic behavior of not only their nestmates, but significantly their material environments. The substrate of the nest itself is a vital part of termite communication practices and knowledge transfer. And there are many examples of non-human sonic knowledge, nearly all of which takes place without ears. Fruit flies, for example, detect vibrations via their antennae, while snakes use the bones in their jaw. The larvae of two species of hornet, Vespa orientalis, which you can see the adult of here, and Vespa crabro, scrape their mandibles against the comb wall of their nests, inducing vibrations, which are felt by the workers who then come to feed the larvae. Particularly mysteriously, plants perceive sound in ways that we don't really understand, possibly related to tension in the xylem vessel. Among social insects, substrate vibrations, which travel through the material of the nest, for example, are the most common kind of sonic communication. Because these creatures can't hear airborne sounds, the environment itself becomes fundamental to the communication assemblage, and these vibrations are picked up by the subgenual organ, which is located in the tibia part of the leg. Termites in particular communicate by raising their heads and smashing them against the colony's substrate, creating pulses of low-frequency vibration around 20 Hertz. They create a repeated drumming motion to communicate signals for courtship and mating, maternal care, foraging, predation, and predator avoidance. These vibrations are also used to learn more about their environments. Two lower drywood termite species, Cryptotermes secundus and Cryptotermes domesticus, determine the size of foraged pieces of wood using vibration. Termite drumming is also elicited in response to environmental change, such as sudden bright light, water, or air currents in the nest. Termites drum not only to disturbances, but also to the drumming signals of nearby soldiers, and together they amplify these signals so they carry further along the nest galleries, which you can see here. Termite communication is therefore local and partial, but very flexible, expanding when other termites join into that communication network. I refer to termite listening practices for two reasons. Firstly, understanding how social insects use their environments could help us to better communicate with the termites themselves. Secondly, and more my focus, is that termite communication is, as a social assemblage of multiple bodies and environments, may offer a blueprint for environmental listening. While airborne cochlear sound, as we do as humans, that kind of listening suggests a distance from the listened to object, termite listening, meanwhile, is a more entangled kind of environmental listening. The substrate or material environment is as much a part of the communication assemblage as any other interlocutor, which are always plural anyway. So how might we, like termites, attune ourselves better to our environment and each other so that other kinds of earthly knowledges might be shared? Could involving the material environment itself into our communications even transform that Promethean relation of humans to the Earth's other inhabitants, whether alive or inert? So I propose a kind of listening practice that builds on what Will Scrimshaw has described as non-cochlear sound. And thinking of non-cochlear sound in terms of the post-human is nothing new. As music theorist Robin James and composer Christopher Swithenbank have both noted, new materialist scholars like Elizabeth Gross, Jane Bennett and Karen Barad all theorize sound in terms of vibration or rhythm to conceptualize more than human ways of being. Jane Bennett's vital materialism, for example, proposes that all matter vibrates with life, a vitality that's equivalent to a kind of agency. Musician and philosopher Steve Goodman, also known as Code 9, refers to an ontology of vibrational force in order to expand sound into its most universal and non-anthropocentric understanding, more related to affect than the ear. In his vibrational ontology, all entities, alive and inert, are affected by the vibrations and rhythms of other entities. Sound thus becomes a universal force, since at a quantum level at the very least, everything vibrates. Material stillness is only supposed by humans based on our threshold of perception. And the diagram you see here is a diagram of string vibration, which is a theoretical concept from quantum physics. But these universalist models, these kind of ontologies, repeat once again the same accumulations and aspiration towards totality that I described at the beginning of this paper. As media theorist Eva Haifa-Giraud writes, quote, "It is important to recognize that all epistemologies or political and ethical approaches, even complex, pluralistic and seemingly open ones, carry their own emissions," end quote. Robin James takes us further, underscoring the violence of such a universalizing gesture. In a new materialist ontology in which all entities are resonating and affecting one another through vibration, what's coded out into the red? What, in other words, is left outside in the creation of a total sonic ontology? And such a universalism also risks foreclosing the exact emancipatory politics it wants to unfold in the first place. As Giraud writes, any politics that insists on total inclusion neglects the fact that some forms of exclusions and refusals are actually quite productive. So I'm less interested in these kind of questions, asking if everything vibrates, even if at some quantum level this might be true. What's the point of such a universalizing gesture if it can't be perceived? Can an abstract and imperceptible relation really create any kind of meaningful ethics or knowledge at all? Perhaps rather than expanding vibration into a universal shared quality that disappears from view, we might instead want to localize vibrational knowledge, bringing it into a threshold of perceptibility. Think again of the termite colony, in which meaningful and tangible environmental knowledge transfer takes place in a highly localized space, and only then can appropriate and collective action be taken. And of course, as humans, our listening practices are very different to those of termites. But I'm interested in the kinds of conditions that could bring together similar material communication assemblages. So in other words, how could a communication network involving humans, non-humans, and material environments be mediated? And this is in part a question of broadening a perceptual threshold in a moment of encounter. Practically speaking, perhaps something like an artwork could be of help with this. In an environmental sound work, for instance, technology may be used to amplify the sounds of a particular landscape or creature, or perhaps transduce vibration into various materials. An artwork is, in the broadest terms, much like the termite colony, a constructed and localized environment of bodies and materials that organizes non-linguistic or affective communication. Thought of as a colony, then, an artwork could help unfold the kinds of knowledge that avoid some of the pitfalls I've described in this paper. An artwork is fundamentally non-universal. No artwork can ever be an ontology or infinite or planetary, and exclusions are therefore inevitable. They're built into the logic of the work. And likewise, due to its affective nature, any knowledge acquired is kind of implicitly understood to be partial. These ideas require a lot more thought, of course, but I am quite interested in what bringing the material environment itself into a pluralized network of knowledge transfer could do. What kinds of relations could it unfold? What kinds of receptivity could it cultivate? Termite listening means listening not only to our environments, but with it, bound together, albeit temporarily and partially, in a moment of listening.
Siobhan, thanks a lot for a talk. Also a great input, and I think it kind of matched your two presentations pretty well. I found this very striking, and how you develop this based on termite listening and environmental listening as an entangled mode of listening. And your approach is the artwork as a colony, and you talk about amplification of vibrations or transduction to various materials. I was just wondering, how does one broaden or lower his or her perceptual thresholds in these types of networks of human, non-human material environments? You said it could be artistic approach, or that there need to be artistic expertise. Is that right? You've got an idea? Can you translate this to me a little? Because that was kind of hard to get.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I guess one thing I didn't say in the video is that this is kind of preliminary research for an artistic research project I plan to create in the next sort of year or so. But I guess in terms of kind of increasing that perceptual threshold, and artwork is just kind of one example of creating that kind of miner's ear or termite listening practice, or whatever we want to call it, because it's very much like a technological intervention into a space and kind of allows you access to particular kinds of sonic communication events. But it could also be, for example, something like a somatic bodywork that trains you to kind of be better at receiving these environmental signals. So it's just kind of one example. Something I kind of think about quite often are people who are quite often dismissed as like delusional, who have these like earthquake sensitivities, and they kind of perceive supposedly before an earthquake these kind of ringings in their ear, or kind of a feeling. And I don't know, this is like a really interesting and quite appealing idea, how can we kind of increase our geosensitivity? And I'm kind of less interested in whether or not there's like credible evidence to kind of back up the idea of geosensitivity, because I think, it's a much more complex form of knowledge.
is it for the because I read a lot about these amplification of these vibrational things, also for people maybe who are deaf, and so the do you think these like bodily listening is something that is also an inclusive activity per se? So, or something that we can also use for artistic research, maybe to not work with the cochlear sound? You said the non-cochlear sound actually is more interesting than the one based on the air. So, what's your opinion on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's quite tricky because I don't necessarily want to start creating these hierarchies of listening practices. And I think there's this kind of tendency sometimes that, you know, as soon as we've discovered this form of listening, to kind of throw out the last kind. But yeah, I mean, it certainly is kind of like useful. I mean, I know like Christine's son, Kim, for example, has done a lot of interesting artworks related to vibration and deafness and this kind of thing. So yeah, I mean, it's kind of tricky because obviously embodied listening allows for reaching beyond species lines a little bit more, but it also, you know, all bodies are different. So there will be a kind of relativism to some extent as well. So again, I'm not trying to create these like universalizing gestures either, because I think that can be quite an oppressive thing.
For sure. And there's another, let's say, pragmatic one on the chat that says, speaking of geosensitivity, because you were talking about this, you spoke about the need to increase sensibility. And P1XY is wondering, that sounds lovely, but how? How do you increase sensibility?
Yeah, that's the $1 million question. I mean, I think, as I said, something like an artwork that allows for a mediation. You know, I talked, I think, a little bit about amplification, or something like sonification, visualization. These are kind of modes that can increase our perceptual threshold. But yeah, in terms of like practically how, like what that might look like, I don't know right now. That's to come.
Okay, as you said, this is an ongoing research project, and you will be working on this, and maybe next year you can show some examples how these sort of approaches might look like, or what sort of artworks could be amplifying or transducing things. So that's perfectly fine. You know, I'm the timekeeper too, so I think if there are no urgent questions right now on the chat, I would rather go on, because the next presentation is going to be a bit more than 10 minutes. I know, because I already watched them. So you will also be on the Discord channel, and people can chat with you. And
yeah, that's right.
And thanks for joining us and for your fantastic presentation, Siobhan.
Yeah, thanks for the invite.
Okay, so then we've got our third presenter, which is Andrea Liu. She's an NYC Berlin-based artist and researcher. She received her undergraduate education at Yale University and was awarded artist residencies in the US, Berlin, Copenhagen, Barcelona, Prague, and Italy. Today, she will talk about connections between sonic theory and posthumanism. The original title of the presentation was something based on Occupy Wall Street, but actually, in fact, due to the pandemic, her speech will take a different turn right now. She will deliver insights into different strands of posthumanism plus a view to the past. So, welcome, Andrea. The virtual stage is yours now.
My talk is in a part of the conference called Posthuman Sounds. What is it that we mean by posthuman, and what would it mean to come up with a sonic theory of posthumanism? Posthumanism as a philosophy has many heterogeneous factions and splinter groups, not all of which comprise a compatible set of theoretical positions. I'm going to share my screen now. Quoting from Anti-Oedipus, Deleuze and Guattari, there's no such thing as either man or nature now, only a process that produces one within the other and couples machines together. Producing machines, desiring machines everywhere, schizophrenic machines, all of species of life, the self and the non-self, outside and inside, no longer have any meaning whatsoever. The subject is not a person, not a whole, but a part of the whole that is made up of parts. It is part of the machine and also itself, divided into cuts from the continuous material flow and parts of the detached signifying chain. Philosophers like Deleuze and Manuel de Landa talk about bodies no longer being bound by skin, but rather flows of affect and intensities, where thought is not human in its origin, but non-local and pre-subjective. This brings us to the Catherine Hale's Donna Haraway wing of posthumanism, the late 20th century cybernetic dream of transforming bodies into information or non-matter, where the boundaries of the autonomous subject are up for grabs, the union of the human with intelligent machine. Hales writes that in the post-human, there are no essential differences or absolute demarcations between bodily existence and computer simulation, cybernetic mechanism and biological organism, robot teleology and human goals. We can think of the famous Alvin Toffler quote, "The central event of the 20th century is the overthrow of matter." This dominant strand of post-human thought that views the body as only a shell that will ultimately be left behind, with subjectivity dispersed throughout the cybernetic circuit. Catherine Hales writes, when system boundaries are defined by information flows and feedback loops rather than epidermal surfaces, a subject becomes a system to be assembled and disassembled rather than an entity whose organic wholeness can be assumed. It's all very 1980s, and by that I mean popular culture of 1980s. You think of films like Total Recall, RoboCop, Blade Runner, novels like William Gibson's Neuromancer, this techno-fetishistic infatuation and enrapturement with effective technology on human consciousness, these poetic rhapsodies and totalizing hyperbole about how technology will change human ontology. If anything, COVID-19 pandemic is a raging refutation of this cybernetic dream that we're going to transcend, supersede, or render irrelevant our biological embodiment. COVID is a stinging rebuke to this cybernetic post-humanist claim that we can shed our bodies and live in an immaterial realm, as it has proven that we're still very chained to the hyperfragility of our human biology. Now, the second strain of posthumanism I want to address is critical posthumanism, shored up by thinkers like Rosi Braidotti. I would characterize this almost as an activist posthumanism, rails against the hypocrisy and the hollowness of the false claims of universalism that underlie the Western canon, Enlightenment, modern philosophical practices, basically humanism. It rejects this paradigm of human as subject and world as object, an idea upon which both our exploitation and our sentimental and nostalgic view of the world is based. It's a critique of anthropocentrism, human exceptionalism, species supremacy, this notion that, nature is just an endless supply of resources for humans to exploit. It's almost a demonization of humanism. It wants to knock the human off its pedestal. It's very POC, people of color / LGBT oriented, much more so than Hales or Haraway. In fact, Steve Goodman, author of Sonic Warfare, calls Hales white posthumanism, wants to give a voice to the voiceless, all the entities that were never elevated to the rank of the human in the first place. To quote music journalist Caldwell Eshin, for African Americans, because the experiences of the Middle Passage, slavery, colonization, and racism have worked to systematically exclude Black people from humanist claims. For Black people, the human is a pointless and treacherous category. It's important to note how much post-humanism is indebted to post-structuralism, to Foucault, even going back farther than post-structuralists, to Nietzsche, howsoever post-humanists may despise or deride, let's say, or dismiss post-structuralists, because of course post-humanism can't have this exhaustion with post-structuralist fixation on language and representation. But if it was not for Foucault's proclamation of the end of man in the order of things that gave rise to the possibility of decentering the human, deconstructing the human as the main political referent, there never would have been this epistemic opening upon which for post-humanism to arise. So when we look at different strands of post-humanism, I've only covered two here. This is a sort of a graph I've made of the different strands. I want to point out the distinction between a type of post-humanism that criticizes either the role of the humanism, or anthropocentrism, but not so much human beings or being human itself, versus a more uncompromising, radical, eliminative post-humanism that actually involves thinking a world without humans, a world in which existing modes of human life are no longer possible. It seeks to undo the human category and conceive of being and becoming without reference to a human condition. When you look at different strands of post-humanism, these are 4 cleavage points with which you can use to differentiate them. consciousness? Is it the notion of consciousness? Is it one of a sovereign, discrete entity, or is it a distributed consciousness? Number two, is human agency just one impetus within a complex, larger network of agencies, or is there something special about human agency? Number three, the degree to which the theory rejects, undermines, corroborates, confirms, or even celebrates the human as a separate and independent form of life. And number three is, of course, manifested in number two and number one. Number four, embodiment. It's a position of great socioeconomic privilege to espouse a theory based on disembodiment. Imagine a shipyard worker who spends 14 hours a day unloading 40-kilo boxes from a ship onto a dock. I bet he can never, espouse a theory that predicated upon the, leaving the body behind as a shell. So David Ciceccio, author of Humanistic Sound and Technological Posthumanism, he observes how sound studies has been relatively absent from posthuman discourse. Of course, posthumanism poses a challenge to sound studies because sound is, by its very definition, anthropocentric. As physiologist Johannes Müller wrote in 1823, without the organ of hearing with its vital endowments, there would be no such thing as sound in the world, but merely vibrations. Sound has been ridden with religious biases about the positive role of hearing, salvation, these trans-historical, essentialist idealization of hearing as a type of pure interiority, and the sonic dimension of experience as the closest thing we have to divinity. These 2,000-year-old Christian theologies of listening, and the idea that speech is one of the essential characteristics of humanity. So what separates humans from animals has a long history dating back to ancient Greece. All these ideas that humans are special, humans are different from everyone else, these are exactly the suppositions that critical posthumanism was seeking to overturn. So in order to problematize these essentialist assumptions about the authenticity of human voice, I want to turn to Jonathan Stern in The Audible Past. He says, the claim that sound reproduction has alienated the voice from the human body implies that the voice and the body existed in some prior, holistic, unalienated, and self-present relation. They assume that at some time prior to the invention of sound reproduction technologies, the body was whole, undamaged, and phenomenologically coherent. By extension, this is to argue that all modern life is disorienting, that the only subject that is whole or at peace with itself is one that is not mediated or fragmented by technology. But the idea of the body's phenomenological unity and sanctity gains power precisely at the moment in its history that the body is being taken apart, reconstructed, and problematized, the 18th and 19th centuries. In contrast, medieval thought and practice often constructed the body as a filthy container for the soul, something to be transcended and overcome in the afterlife. Another thing that poses something of a conundrum for sound studies to be integrated into posthuman discourse is that the history of sound recording is inextricably linked to death. And I'm not sure where that leaves us, with posthuman ideas. With the advent of sound recording in the 19th century, heralded as being able to bring back voices of the dead. I mean, we take it for granted now, but imagine in the middle of the 19th century, where once a person dies, you never hear their voice anymore. Imagine, how startling it would be with the advent of sound recording that you could hear the voices of dead people. As Jonathan Stern says, in this respect, sound recording followed innovations in other major 19th century industries like canning and embalming. Through the historical process of making sound recording more permanent, which began as nothing more than a Victorian fantasy about a machine, the historical process was itself altered. As beliefs surrounding death, the preservation of the dead body, transcendence, and temporality shaped or explained sound reproduction itself became a distinctive way of relating to, understanding, and experiencing death. So, when we think of how can sound studies and posthumanism be in fruitful dialogue with each other, instead of going into the future, which is what we usually associate with posthumanism, science fiction, future, I would suggest we go back into the past, into the mid or late 1800s, where we find the first stirrings of posthumanist thought, or what might be considered posthumanist suppositions, without them ever being called posthumanist thought. For instance, in The Audible Past, quoting, we learn Johannes Müller's 1856 theory eradicated distinctions between internal and external sensations, resulting in a mechanical rather than spiritual ground for sensation. Whatsoever stimulated the nerve could cause the sensation. Müller's concept of hearing is therefore antithetical to romantic notions of inner perception, while the latter approaches imagine a willful subject immersed in world of sensuous experience, Muller's sensing subject is more like an amalgamation of perceptual events connected to both internal and external stimuli. So here we have the first blueprint of a post-human listener. Instead of the sovereign human subject doing the listening, my listening is merely spliced into a network of existing sensations and perceptual events. The second example I want to use is the phonautograph, invented in 1857 by Martinville. It was a device so that deaf people could see sound. It was produced images from sound vibrations by tracing the sound waves on blackened glass or paper. Alexander Bell wanted to perfect it. He was married to a deaf person. He wanted deaf people to be more integrated into hearing society. Now it failed, but the phonautograph, the failure of the phonautograph eventually led to the phonograph, leading Frederick Kittler to say deafness was at the very beginning of sound reproduction. So quoting from the Audible Past, in his early experiments with the phonautograph, Bell was struck by its structural similarity to the human ear and sought to better imitate that ear function. When he reported this idea to his friend Clarence Blake, Blake suggested that you just get to this image of that's the sketch of it. Blake suggested using an actual human ear for the machine. Blake had studied hearing and perception and taught Bell the workings of the human ear. Taking advantage of his connections with the Harvard Medical School, Blake procured 2 ears, one for Bell and one for himself. Each ear was then affixed to a machine, and the ear phonautograph was born. So this, is like quintessential tropes of high post-humanism, right? The seamless melding of human and machine. And furthermore, the destabilization even of the demarcation between human and machine, right? Parts of human anatomy are being grafted onto machine in order to help deaf people hear better. So if we roam around in these 19th century understandings of hearing, the construction of the ear as a discrete object of medical knowledge, and the growth of otology as a field of medical science, the rise of the ear as a unique sound appliance, and Stern's assertion that sound reproduction technologies depend on humans delegating our hearing to machines that hear for us. Within this milieu, we can stumble upon the first stirrings of post-humanist ideas without them ever being labeled as post-humanism.
Good to see you live.
Hi. Good to see you. Good to see
For
you.
your presentation. So I've got one question on at the very beginning. There was quite a statement that I stumbled across, and you said COVID-19 is a stinging rebuke that we can live in a material realm. So do you consider these recent developments and the pandemic and home concerts and all the other stuff going on right now, is this a social and theoretical burning glass at the moment for you? How do you use this, or does this contribute to your thoughts that you just delivered?
Yeah, when you say a burning glass, you mean a type of prism that it's being reflected through, or?
Yeah, or you might take a closer look at something, or is this also adding to your theoretical thoughts that you just delivered?
Right. Yeah. No, I think the COVID remark really it came out of just my frustration. Maybe I shouldn't be saying this, but my frustration with how these ideas of post-humanism are incredibly elitist, and these. You think of Institute for the Future of Humanities, that's the big post-humanist institute. It's at Oxford, and it's very capital intensive, and multi-million-dollar projects to try to find prosthesis or try to extend human life, and you have to have tremendous capital and tremendous privilege to involve yourself in this fantasy that we're going to leave our bodies behind. So I think that aspect, I just sort of threw that in there, even though that was not really in the flow of the theory of what I was talking about, because I think it has to. I just like when theories are just, for me, post-humanism, like Catherine Hales, which I cite a lot, I take her seriously as literary theory, but I don't take her seriously as philosophy or as like social criticism. I don't think she captures anything about our world, because it's only the top 1% or 50.56% of the population that could possibly propose such a thing that we that we can live we can leave our body behind. That it's possible to live life on Earth, without bodies. The other thing, there's also a tremendous tautology at the heart of posthumanism, which is that it's all about sort of as I said, knocking the human off the pedestal. But if we were really in a post-humanist moment, then it would not be humans that were doing the theorizing. It would be like animals or plants or monkeys or whatever. And there's sort of a tautology. Let me put it to you this way. I think Jóri Spivak, the post-colonial theorist in the 90s, she said something like, the same people who told me 20 years ago that I can't have a voice are the same people who are telling me now that I do have a voice. Nothing has changed. So before it was humans saying, we're the center of everything. Now in posthumanism, it's like they're saying, no, humans, we're not at the center of anything. You guys, this noblesse oblige, we don't want humans to be the center of everything, but it's still humans that are calling the shots. It's not like monkeys or, something are like, propounding the theory of posthumanism. And I think I just want to say Gary Hall really captured this well. He's the, of all the posthumanist theories, he's the only one who has talked about this. He's not a posthumanist theory, but he talked about this inconsistency. And let me just give you a little bit of what he said. I couldn't fit it into my talk. This is Gary Hall of Center for Post-Digital Cultures in the UK. Even the most apparently radical of post-human and anti-humanist theories, including new materialist, media archaeologists, and object-oriented philosophers, they may endeavor to decenter humanism and the human from their traditional place at the heart of Western thought by privileging the non-human, the object, and the planetary-wide crisis of life itself, articulated by the concept of the Anthropocene. But the main way such theorists do so is by writing big mansplaining books containing original ideas and ontologies attributed to them as individual human authors, very much to the exclusion of other human and non-human actors and elements on a copyright, all rights reserved basis. To put it briefly, and in the most obvious of terms, animals cannot own copyright. As we know from the case of Naruto, and he talks about this monkey that took a selfie, and then there was a debate about whether the monkey can own the copyright to the selfie. Anyway, so I think so I think that's where the remark I made about that that COVID is a stinging rebuke was coming from just this exasperation with how this entire wing, this theory is incredibly removed from, it's incredibly elitist in a way, as I already said, I guess. Yeah. I don't know, does that answer the question?
Oh, yeah, I think it did by far. So, well, we still got some couple of minutes for more questions from the audience using the live stream or the stream back options that you could choose. I'm just checking if we got some questions right now. So I'll just keep on talking and have one more thing, yeah. Because I've got I very much like the idea to jump back rather than to take a look at the future, and I like the idea of going back to the phonograph and talking about dead people. So and I was kind of missing one thing, because talking about dead people and bodies and so on. Where's the theoretical bridge, actually? So, and I was thinking, or I was just wondering if maybe also ontology approaches might somehow fit in, talking about these things from the past within sounds and so on. Does this kind of make sense to you, or is it something that doesn't really fit into what you just delivered?
Yeah, I think so. I think what I was trying to do, and I guess I wanted to explain this better. There wasn't enough time. What I was trying to do with the very heavy reliance on Jonathan Stern's audible past as sort of the bulwark for my theory of how my proposal for how posthumanism and sound studies can is that I get frustrated because there's a lot of what I call sloppy posthumanism or lazy posthumanism, I think, in a lot of sounds. And let me give you an example. Like just this idea that any artist who uses an avatar is posthuman, or Laurie Anderson's technologized alter ego, or she shares use of the modified cyborg voice in the hit song Believe, and people would say, oh yeah, that's posthuman. Once I read in a musicology journal, I can't remember the author, he said, well, rock music is humanist and electronic music is posthuman, because rock music is about expressing yourself and the singer-songwriter and using your own voice, and then electronic music is this like submersion of the human subject into a distributed system in which all the individual layers and components are allowed to speak. And I just I was frustrated with this because I thought this naive equation of rock music equals humanism equals authentic equals good. This is exactly this is what I call lazy posthumanism. This elevation of humans, like humans are better than everybody else. Humans are what makes us special. These are exactly the suppositions that critical posthumanism was seeking to overturn. So I just I think the problem. I think the problem is that posthumanism it's a philosophy, and then the transition of posthumanism into an aesthetic is something that I find, I guess, problematic. As I said, like when people say, hey, any musician who uses an avatar is posthuman. Like that does not do justice to the breadth of what posthumanism was trying to say. So, but your question to do with ontology, I'm trying to think. And you said, how are you relating that to the body? You said that me bringing up like the dead ear and everything, that's what made you think of ontology. Is that what you were saying?
Yeah, but this might not be important enough to keep on talking, because when I take a look at the time, I think we're already done. We can continue this maybe on the Discord chat.
Oh, okay.
And invite people there, because what you just said was even more important than my little thought about building a theoretical bridge between two things. I very much like the idea of having critique and not just naive applications of some sort of post-human strategies and things. I very much like that, what you had in the end. So for me, this would be a fairly good good ending right now. Thanks, every presenters, and maybe we'll see each other or write each other on Discord. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.